AITA for not telling my roommate about my large salary, when I'm aware he's been struggling to pay rent. So, I'm a 28-year-old woman living in a 2-bedroom apartment with 3 roommates. It's small and cramped, and honestly, sometimes I feel like we're all on top of each other. There's barely enough room for all our stuff, and privacy is basically non-existent, but we make it work. We're all pretty laid back. We were all in grad school when we moved in together, and cheap rent is cheap rent, so none of us really complained about the setup. For 6 years now, we've split the rent evenly, and it's been mostly smooth sailing. Even after they all graduated and started working full-time, we kept splitting the rent, utilities, and groceries evenly, as we always had. To me, it was the natural, fair thing to do. Sure, they were out in the workforce now, but I was still in my residency, grinding through insane hours that left me physically drained and mentally fried. Some weeks, I was clocking 80 hours or more at the hospital, grabbing sleep whenever and wherever I could, sometimes even in my car during quick breaks between shifts. By the time I got home, I was a zombie, barely able to muster the energy for basic conversation, let alone think about changing our rent split. I was too busy surviving, honestly. Most nights, I'd trudge up to my room, if you could even call it that. It's a tiny, low-ceilinged space just off the attic storage, almost more of a large closet or an unfinished home office than an actual bedroom. I never bothered to decorate it much because, really, there wasn't room for much beyond my bed, a dresser, and a small desk where I kept my textbooks and notes. Privacy was limited, to say the least. There wasn't even a real door, just a flimsy curtain I'd hung up for a semblance of separation from the main living area, but it was enough for me. I've always been a quiet, introverted person, and between my grueling hours at the hospital and my need for solitude to recharge, it worked. I was grateful that my roommates respected my space, even if it wasn't ideal. By the time I finally finished my residency and became a fully licensed emergency physician, my roommates hadn't even noticed. It wasn't surprising, they rarely saw me anyway, and I wasn't the type to make a big announcement. Residency had taken everything out of me, and all I wanted was to step quietly into the next phase of my career. Once I was officially licensed, I transitioned into a full-time attending physician role at the same hospital where I'd already spent years working, both as an EMT during my college days and later during my residency. That place had become like a second home to me, and slipping into a physician's role there felt as natural as breathing. The pay increase was a huge relief, but it wasn't life-changing overnight. I was still staring down a mountain of student loans from med school that loomed over me like a dark cloud, a constant reminder of the financial sacrifices I'd made. Sure, it felt good to be making real money finally, but I had a lot of ground to cover before I could consider myself comfortable, so I stuck with our original rent split without a second thought. After all, I'd been living with these people for 6 years. Our arrangement had always worked, and I didn't see why it needed to change now. Plus, it was just practical. I didn't have a partner, no kids, and no reason to move into some swanky, overpriced condo just because I could technically afford it. To be completely honest, I didn't see myself as owing them anything more just because I had a higher paycheck now. We'd all come into this apartment with the same understanding, and I felt like the agreement we had was fair. Splitting things evenly meant no one had to worry about who was paying more or who owed whom. It was simple and uncomplicated, and after all the stress of med school, that simplicity was something I valued deeply. I wanted to keep things exactly as they were, and I figured my roommates would feel the same. That's where things stood until yesterday. My roommate, who's 27, ended up in a car accident. He's the youngest of the 3 of us and probably the one who struggles the most with money. Out of all my roommates, A has always been the one who was the most open about his financial difficulties. I knew he'd been struggling for a while, trying to make ends meet while paying his share of the rent and utilities each month. So when I saw his name come up on the patient list during my shift, my heart sank a little. I wasn't sure what I'd be walking into, but I tried to steady myself as I entered the exam area. When he was brought in by ambulance, I felt a surge of relief upon realizing it wasn't as serious as I'd feared. He had a bit of whiplash, which I knew would hurt like hell but would heal with time, and a nasty cut from some broken glass on his arm. It was bleeding pretty heavily, so he needed a few stitches, but all things considered, he was going to be fine. The relief I felt was real, knowing he hadn't sustained anything more critical. I'd seen enough accidents to know how much worse it could have been, so I put on my best professional face and focused on his care. But as soon as he spotted me in full scrubs, I could tell that something clicked in his mind. I was working as one of the attending doctors, not as a resident or an intern scrambling around. It must have dawned on him in that moment that I was no longer in the training stages of my career. Until then, I'd kept pretty quiet about my transition from residency to a full attending physician role. I hadn't thought it was worth mentioning at home. I mean, who cared? It's not like we all sat around discussing each other's career moves. I went to work, and I came home. That was about the extent of my interaction with them, and it seemed to suit all of us just fine. But as I was lying there, it was like I could see the wheels turning in his head. Even though he couldn't have guessed my exact salary, he knew enough to realize that an attending physician makes significantly more than a resident. I'm sure it took him all of 2 seconds to pull out his phone later, do a quick search, and get a rough idea of how much my pay had increased since becoming fully licensed. And knowing it probably stung him even more, knowing I'd been making at least double what he and our other 2 roommates brought in combined. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was focused on my shift and relieved that he was going to be okay. To me, it was just a chance encounter with a familiar face during a routine shift in the ED. I assumed he'd go home, rest up, and that would be the end of it. But apparently, that wasn't the case. What I didn't realize was how deeply it bothered him. I found out later that he'd left the hospital feeling angry, maybe even betrayed. By the time I finally got home that night, utterly drained from a grueling shift, he'd already gathered our other 2 roommates. I walked into the apartment, just wanting to collapse, but there they were, all 3 of them, waiting for me in the living room. It felt weird, like I was walking into an intervention or something. They were sitting there, arms crossed, staring at me with these unreadable expressions. I barely had the energy to make sense of it. I wasted no time. The second I put my bag down, he demanded to know how much I was making. He came at me with this intensity I'd never seen from him before. I was caught completely off guard. I hadn't expected him to even care, let alone confront me about it. But there he was, asking me point blank about my salary. I hadn't prepared for that, and I was too tired to even think of an evasive answer, so I just told them the truth. It felt like the right thing to do at the moment. I'd been awake for over 24 hours at that point, and I was so exhausted that lying or sugarcoating felt pointless. Besides, I figured honesty would defuse the situation. But as soon as the words were out, I could see the shock on their faces. It was like I'd admitted to some huge betrayal. Well, that was a mistake. They all lost their minds. I immediately launched into this long, emotional rant, going off about how he'd been struggling every single month just to scrape together his share of the rent, living paycheck to paycheck and barely keeping his head above water. He was clearly angry, his voice rising with every word, and I could tell that he'd been holding back these feelings for a while. As he went on, he didn't just talk about rent, he mentioned everything, from groceries to utilities, even small stuff like splitting the costs of household basics. He made it clear that he was frustrated with how he'd been pinching pennies to get by while I'd been, in his words, hoarding my money, all while sitting on a physician's salary. He described how, in the past few months, there had been days when he'd had to skip meals or rely on cheap, barely nutritious options just to make it through to the next payday. A lot of it was news to me, and it was hard to hear, but I also felt blindsided. It wasn't like I'd been hiding my salary on purpose, I just hadn't thought it was relevant. I could feel my shoulders tensing as he went on, saying he felt I'd taken advantage of the situation, making him struggle while I sat back and lived easy. Then, the other 2 roommates jumped in, and it was like a tidal wave. They started piling on, saying they felt completely blindsided, too, and that they were hurt and frustrated I hadn't offered to contribute more since my salary was so much higher now. They weren't as openly angry as but the disappointment in their voices stung. They talked about feeling betrayed, like I'd been sitting on a secret that affected all of them. One of them, B, mentioned how he'd been skipping out on seeing friends or doing things he enjoyed because he couldn't justify the expense, while I'd been, as they put it, sitting pretty. It seemed like they had already discussed this among themselves before I got home because their words had a rehearsed quality, like they'd been brewing and boiling all day, waiting for me. They told me it was unfair, that the whole situation felt one-sided and lopsided now that they knew what I was making. To them, the idea of me keeping our split the same when I could clearly afford more came across as selfish or, worse, intentionally deceptive. Their voices got louder, overlapping each other, frustration radiating from every word. It was overwhelming, but I just stood there, taking it all in. I'd been trained to keep a straight face under pressure, so I stood quietly, trying to process everything without showing the exhaustion that was creeping up on me. At that point, I was absolutely done. I'd been on my feet for hours, dealing with emergency after emergency, giving everything I had to help people in crisis. And now I was standing in my own apartment, getting chewed out by my roommates in what should have been my sanctuary. I tried to keep my composure, keeping my expression neutral and my voice steady, though I could feel a kind of hollow anger bubbling up inside me. I waited until they were done and then finally spoke, calmly but firmly. I explained that I still had loans to pay off, a mountain of debt from med school that loomed over me every day, and that I was still in the process of building up my savings and gaining a foothold after years of grinding through residency. I told them I wasn't in some magical financial paradise. I was just finally making a bit of progress towards stability. I know I was probably blunt, maybe even a bit cold, but I was beyond exhausted. Sugarcoating it felt like an extra layer of effort I just didn't have the energy for. I finished talking and stood there, looking at their faces, feeling like there was a canyon between us now, one I hadn't even seen coming. Without saying anything more, I just turned and went straight to bed, ignoring their complaints that trailed behind me. I barely made it to my room before collapsing, feeling the weight of both my exhaustion and the sudden shift in my living situation pressing down on me. I figured they'd blow off steam overnight, and we'd talk things through in the morning. But when I woke up today, it was like walking into a freezer. All three of them were giving me the silent treatment, making it perfectly clear that they weren't ready to let this go. It was like the air had turned colder, the atmosphere thick with tension and disappointment. They barely even looked at me, and when they did, it was with these judgmental, almost hurt expressions, like I'd crossed some line I didn't even know existed. We'd shared this space for 6 years, and suddenly, everything felt different, like I was an outsider in my own home. As I moved around the apartment, getting ready for the day, I felt the weight of their silence pressing down on me. They weren't saying anything directly, but their presence was almost louder than words. The few glances they threw my way were filled with this quiet resentment that cut deeper than any shouting could. It was painfully clear that they weren't planning to let this slide. They wanted another conversation, and I could sense it simmering beneath the surface, waiting to bubble up. I knew they were going to ask me to either contribute more or to help with his rent, and a part of me wondered if they were right. Had I been too focused on my own struggles to see theirs? Should I have been more proactive, offering to help him out sooner? The thing is, I liked our arrangement the way it was. I liked the simplicity, the idea of living frugally while I got my financial life in order. I didn't want things to change, especially when I felt I was just getting a handle on my own situation. But now, seeing how upset they all were, I couldn't help but feel guilty. I thought we'd all been on the same page, all comfortable with the way things were, but now it was like I was looking at our situation from a whole new perspective. Had I missed something? Had I been selfish or AITA, thinking only of myself while they struggled? I really didn't want to mess up the living situation we'd built together over these years. It was a setup that had worked for so long, and I'd been happy with it, content in our little arrangement. But now, I felt like I was being cornered, guilt-tripped into paying more just because my financial circumstances had changed. Update. First off, thank you all for your advice, support, and well wishes. I was truly overwhelmed by the responses, and I read through every single comment. It was heartening to see that so many people took the time to help me work through this, and I wanted to come back to answer some common questions and give a bit of an update. Let me start by explaining our living situation, as I realized I left a few details out that might clarify things. Our apartment is a 2-bedroom, technically, but it's not as straightforward as that sounds. We have one master bedroom that's large and comes with its own bathroom, which A and his girlfriend share. Then there's a smaller bedroom that our fourth roommate, D, occupies. My room isn't technically a bedroom. It's a converted space off the attic storage. It's about the same size as D's bedroom but with a low slanted ceiling, no closet, and just a curtain for a door. I always liked my space and didn't mind the quirks. It's quiet and tucked away, and I had accepted that as part of our setup for years. As for why I told them the truth about my salary, honestly, I was caught off guard and exhausted after a long shift. When I walked in that night and found myself ambushed by all three of them, I wasn't exactly prepared to handle it tactfully. I started tossing out numbers right away, and it was clear he'd done some research after spotting me at the hospital. He was pretty close with his guesses, so instead of dodging the question or giving them a vague answer, I just confirmed it. I didn't provide an exact figure, but he already had a ballpark idea, and in that moment, I didn't have the energy to navigate around the truth. And why did he Google it? Your guess is as good as mine. Knowing he was probably just sitting around in triage, bored and frustrated with nothing to do but scroll his phone. I'm sure seeing me there in a doctor's capacity was a shock, especially given that none of them even realized I'd completed my residency. I can only assume he sat there, thinking about it, letting his frustration build as he searched up typical salaries for someone in my position. Now, onto the actual updates. After the blow-up, I decided I needed to talk to D, our fourth roommate, one-on-one. D was the least vocal during the confrontation, and I felt like I could get a more balanced perspective from him. He's still in grad school, in his mid-20s, and honestly, I've always thought of him as the most level-headed of the group. When we spoke, he broke down the situation from their point of view in a much calmer way, and hearing it laid out helped me understand where the anger was coming from. It turns out, had been stewing over more than just my salary. He came home after the accident furious not only because of his wrecked car and the hospital bill he'd have to pay, but because he genuinely felt blindsided by my income. He'd assumed I was still in the same boat as them, financially speaking, and he felt like I'd been deceptive by keeping quiet. Apparently, he and his girlfriend had discussed it extensively before I got home that night, and she was already frustrated because she'd been covering parts of his rent during the months he was between jobs. I had no idea she'd been helping him out financially. In all honesty, I kept to myself and never pried into their personal lives, so I wasn't aware he was struggling that much. It turns out that I had convinced his girlfriend that I should have been contributing more all along, and she, in turn, supported him in confronting me. Together, they'd gone to D and presented their case to him before I got home, framing it as though I was somehow freeloading by not pitching in more, despite my higher salary. They were so convinced that they were in the right that they'd staged this whole intervention, feeling justified in confronting me as a group. D told me that one of their main grievances was that I didn't help out around the house in the same way they did. I buy my own food, cook my own meals, and keep my own space clean. I didn't participate in their communal cooking or cleaning much, but that wasn't out of any sense of superiority. It was just a habit I developed out of necessity. Between residency and my irregular shifts, I was almost never around during typical meal times, and I didn't want to rely on others for food or chores when I wasn't contributing in that way. It had always seemed simpler to just handle my own things, especially since I wasn't around to create any mess in the common areas. In their eyes, though, this meant I was disconnected from them and from the shared responsibilities of the apartment. But here's where it really struck me. They told D they felt that I didn't need the space as much as others might. This apartment had always been passed down from student to student. People left when they chose to, and new people came in, usually based on mutual connections. I reminded D that our place wasn't need-based housing. It was just an affordable setup that we all happened to find through friends when we needed it. No one had ever discussed financial need as a factor when we moved in or agreed on the rent split. D then asked me why I didn't want to move out on my own, given my financial position. I explained that while my income was certainly higher than theirs, I still had a significant amount of debt from medical school that I was chipping away at. I explained that my net worth was likely still negative, given how much I owed, and that living frugally was helping me finally make a dent in my loans. I also shared with him that, despite the stigma around physician salaries, not every doctor is rich, and many of us are trying to climb out of debt for years before we feel stable. When he heard this, Dee went quiet. I think he genuinely hadn't realized the scope of my debt and just assumed I was set because he knew I'd had a scholarship during undergrad. I had to explain that my athletic eligibility only covered my first year, so my scholarship was limited, and I'd taken on a significant amount of debt for medical school and beyond. After that conversation with Dee, I knew it was time to move on. Their perception of my financial situation had fundamentally changed our dynamic, and I couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what I did, their attitude toward me wasn't going to shift. I realized that any lingering resentment over my income would continue to bubble up in one way or another, and I didn't want to live under a microscope, constantly defending my choices or feeling pressured to pay more simply because of my paycheck. This morning, I made a decision. I let them know that I'll be staying until the end of my lease, and then I'll be moving out. I told them they're welcome to find someone else for my room, and I wished them well in advance. The tension in the air finally seemed to ease a little. I think they were relieved to hear I'd made a decision, and they accepted my choice without pushing back. For the first time since all this began, there was an odd sense of closure. Now, I'm looking at the next chapter. I've started browsing studio apartments in the area, and I'm also considering the idea of putting a down payment on a house. As much as I'd been clinging to the comfort of my familiar setup, I'm starting to see this as a necessary push out of my comfort zone. I'd always told myself that I liked the simplicity of our arrangement, that I didn't need to live alone or have a space that was just mine. But now, I'm beginning to realize that maybe this is an opportunity to start building a life that reflects where I am, rather than where I was. This whole situation, frustrating as it's been, has given me a chance to reflect on what I want. Moving out feels like the right choice, both for my own peace of mind and to let them live with someone whose needs are more in line with theirs. I'm grateful to everyone here who helped me see that. Here's to new beginnings and to taking a step forward, no matter how unexpected the circumstances might be. Thank you all again for your kind words, your advice, and your encouragement. This has been a learning experience in more ways than one, and I feel ready to embrace whatever comes next.